BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello there, this is the podcast of Inside Science from BBC Radio 4, first broadcast on the 16th of April 2020. For the millions of species in this country that aren't human, life continues as normal, which means for those of us who can get outside, we have the chance to marvel at spring's wildlife sex disco going on around us as the birds, bees and badgers all hunt for a mate. Here's the glorious noises from producer Fee's garden. Hang on to that comforting sound because we, in our position as the apex predator, have certain responsibilities, and this week we're going to look at some of the other stuff we've forgotten to worry about since the lockdown changed our lives. While we're all dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, an arguably bigger crisis is being sidelined. Climate change, or climate breakdown, is still happening, but it's dropped lower on the news agenda, except for virus-related events. For example, at the start of this month, when the decision was made that COP26, the annual climate change summit, due to be held in Glasgow, was to be postponed until 2021. Is it concerning that tackling climate change has been put on hold, or does the current lockdown provide opportunities for how to do things differently? Writer and environmentalist George Monbiot sees hope in the current crisis. He recently wrote that coronavirus is a wake-up call for a complacent civilization, and when he joined me, I started by asking what he meant by that.
It reminds us that for all our intense technologies and our remarkable layer upon layer of rich development, we still belong to the material world and ultimately are still governed by biology and physics. And sometimes it can seem as if we've detached ourselves from that world, as if we no longer have to care about what's going on outside our capsules. And we move from one enclosure to another, from our homes to our cars, to our offices, to the shopping mall, back into the car, back home, scarcely touching the outdoor world at all. But then the outdoor world still has massive effects on our lives, just as much as ever before, but they may be a bit delayed. And so one hope I have is that this horrendous pandemic reminds us that we are totally dependent on the contingencies of nature. And if we don't engage properly with the rest of the living world, it will engage disastrously with us.
So in the current near global lockdown, there are all sorts of things like we're seeing reductions in air pollution. There's a bumpy year for wildflowers in the UK because the roadside verges aren't being mowed. Greenhouse gas emissions are plummeting. Isn't that all just going to bounce back once we get to grips with the disease?
I think quite a lot of it will bounce back. It's hard to know what's going to stick and what's not. But I think the habit of thought, the idea that we're not as secure as we thought we were, perhaps that will change. It could be that the bubble of false comfort in which we've been living, often living quite complacently, has now burst, and we'll recognise that we are far more vulnerable than perhaps many people thought to the whims of nature, and we'll start taking issues such as climate breakdown and ecological breakdown much more seriously. That's my hope at any rate.
You say we've been living in a bubble of false comfort, but false comfort is still comfort and people do like to be comfortable. And most people I know are having a pretty rubbish time in lockdown. If they're lucky, they're just bored and constrained, but many are also frightened and worried about income and health. And my prediction is people like comfort and maybe we'll just build up another bubble ASAP.
Of course, yes, people could just tunnel back under the blankets and pretend that life can just go on as it went on before and we don't have to worry about existential questions. But I think a lot of people are going to recognise that we are highly vulnerable, that we're affected by the biology and the physics of the rest of the living world. And we'll see that that very exposed place in which we find ourselves is real. It seemed unreal for so long because of our insulation from the contingencies of nature. We thought we were safe. We thought we had removed ourselves so far from the ferocity of the natural world that we just didn't have to think about it anymore. And this has been a very stark and rude reminder that, yeah, we have to think about it very hard indeed. And we have to think not just about the virus, but we also have to start thinking about climate breakdown.
Do you think we're going to need a lockdown equivalent to get us to reduce our carbon footprints?
Climate breakdown takes place over a longer timescale, and our response can take place over a slightly longer timescale than the response to the pandemic, though we haven't got much time at all. I mean, we have to act immediately, but we can spread that action out over several years. But we really do have to engage in far more drastic climate action than we've done so far if we're going to prevent utter catastrophe from being visited upon us with 2 or 3 or 4 degrees of global heating. So, yeah, I mean, while we have to act fast, we don't have to lock ourselves down in the same way as we've had to do with the pandemic. Yes, it would be great if we travel a lot less, particularly use aeroplanes a lot less, and use technologies like the one that we're using at the moment to talk to each other instead. It would be great if we realise that actually we can live just fine without filling our lives with loads and loads of junk. It would be great if we shop less than we do at the moment. It would be great if we recognise that life doesn't have to continue along the lines that we were living that life before. So there are possibilities that we'll come out of this a more thoughtful and engaged species than we were when we went in. I really hope that's the case.
I suppose it just depends on everyone's individual choice. So personally, I'm very happy with avoiding shopping, but then I was always very happy to avoid shopping. Flying, however, is another matter because, of course, it's a democracy, and if I want to fly to Dubrovnik to swim in the Mediterranean and eat pastries, that's my choice. And you can't undo all the infrastructure, the cheap flights, the tourism that make that possible.
Well, you can, as we've seen. In fact, all these things which seemed absolutely fixed and immobile can suddenly be changed, as we've found out with the necessary response to the coronavirus. We can actually live in a completely different way and still survive. Obviously, we've suffered a very extreme and sudden economic dislocation, but we can have economic change which isn't so extreme, isn't so sudden, and leads to far more positive outcomes of switching towards a green economy, for example. But one of the things which we really can't do is to keep on flying at the rate that we've been flying. Flying is something done massively, disproportionately by the rich. Only 20% of the world's people have ever gotten an aeroplane. And yet the impacts of that flying are visited disproportionately upon the poor. So for us to say, well, it's my human right to fly, it's a matter of freedom, it's a matter of choice, I must be allowed to fly, is depriving other people of their freedom, their choice, their human rights, in fact, their lives. Because it's those other people who never fly, including the poorest people in the world, who are the most likely to get hit first and worst by climate breakdown.
But that's asking people who have the income to deprive themselves of something so that other people that they don't meet and they haven't come across. I mean, it doesn't feel like we've permanently changed the way that we travel. We've just pressed a pause button.
Well, what you've touched upon here is the limits of consumer choice as a means of changing things. It's a very poor, very weak tool for implementing change when we're faced with structural problems like climate breakdown. And what has to happen is that governments have to govern. That's, again, something that we've just seen with the coronavirus, that governments had to step in. It wasn't enough just to say, oh, please don't go to the pub and please don't go to the concert and please don't go to the football match. They actually had to ban it. They actually had to say, you may not, because it's in the wider interests of society that you don't. And however much that might affect you and affect your freedom of choice, actually lives are at stake. And exactly the same formula applies to climate breakdown.
Why do you think the government have responded with willingness to the current pandemic threat, but they've dragged their heels so much on arguably a much bigger existential risk like climate change?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think it could be something to do with the difference between an acute crisis and a chronic one. It could also be that climate breakdown directly affects the interests of this very powerful lobby, the fossil fuel industry, which does not want action taken on climate breakdown. And in many parts of the world, we have governments which are inordinately influenced by that lobby. And the thing is, with the coronavirus, you can say, OK, all economic sectors are going to take a hit, but it's going to be a temporary hit. And then we, the government, are going to encourage you and help you to get back on your feet and to get the economy moving. But with climate breakdown, we're saying you, the fossil fuel industry, are going to have to disappear, more or less, permanently. Because the only way we're going to tackle this issue is to leave fossil fuels in the ground. So those huge reserves of yours, on which your share value depends, can no longer be mobilised. You're going to have to wind yourselves up. And that's a very different call to the call that the government is making on the virus. And so what happens in response is that the fossil fuel companies mount a massive lobbying effort through the media, through the think tanks they fund, through the organisations, the lobbying, campaigning organisations they fund, directly through funding political parties to prevent that from happening. And so far, unfortunately, they've been largely successful.
Is there a chance that, given the government appears to be listening to scientists about the COVID pandemic, that climate scientists could say, hey, whilst you're listening to expert opinion, can we talk about mitigating global warming?
It's quite interesting, isn't it, how science can knock on the door and be shut out for years and years. And then suddenly, when there's an acute and sudden emergency, it just has to be let in. So we've seen several world leaders who really have almost staked their claim to power on their anti-science positions, especially when it comes to issues like climate breakdown, suddenly being forced to listen to the scientists and to take science seriously. And denial just doesn't get any traction at all against a pandemic. Now, the big question is, does this mean that those governments which have been so hostile to listening to climate scientists will start to pay some attention, that desperately needed attention, to what those scientists have been saying? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I just hope and pray that they do.
I feel like you have an optimistic take on what humankind is capable of. Do you think we can combat climate change and COVID all in one go?
I do think that potentially one leads to the other. What we have shown is that we can both make and tolerate massive social change in order to cope with an emergency that threatens everybody. And that's exactly what we need with climate breakdown. And we were told throughout, I've spent 35 years now writing and campaigning on this issue. And throughout that time, I've been told, no, that's hopelessly unrealistic. You can't do that. People would never put up with that. And actually far more fundamental changes, albeit on a shorter time span, have been made in response to the pandemic than any of those that I've been calling for in response to climate breakdown. So, yeah, what it shows us is this is stuff we can do.
Do you know if anyone in government is dealing with climate breakdown at all during the pandemic crisis?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, yes, I know civil servants who are still engaged on this, but their voices are going to be pretty muted and their efforts are not going to be given much attention by ministers at the moment. And of course, an immediate result of it is we've seen the abandonment or the postponement of the COP26 climate talks. Now, I think that was necessary. I don't think there was any choice about the matter, really. But it would be tragic if those talks were knocked off course in such a way that they can't be the highly effective meeting that they desperately need to be.
I was actually quite surprised that COP26 was delayed. I thought that they'd use that to sort of showcase that you don't need a physical presence, you don't need to travel, because, going back to a Copenhagen conference, there was always this big dilemma of people going to a climate conference and not wanting to fly there. So, doing a virtual one might be an answer to that.
I would love to see it done virtually. I think it would be a very strong and powerful signal to run that conference virtually. But at the moment, just don't see heads of state doing that. I mean, governments live in the Stone Age, technologically. They seem to be highly suspicious of new communications technologies. And, we've seen ministers sort of fumbling with video conferencing and not quite getting the hang of it and sort of really struggling to bring themselves up to date with it. We've seen Parliament, which can't meet in person, where you would think it would be really quite an easy thing to get them all on a big video conference call and discussing the same issues by those means with electronic voting. But of course, Parliament has resisted such technological change for years and years. And so that shift would be a really major culture shift. And unfortunately, I don't think governments are ready to make that. I would love it if they did. I think it would be a wonderful thing.
George Monbiot. Inside Science at bbc.co.uk is the email if you have any thoughts to share with us. Unless you want to tell me that climate change is a myth, we're past that point and well into whether we're going to do anything or not now. Because carbon accounting doesn't happen in isolation. It's about making choices, like George Monbiot just mentioned. Reducing the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere from polluting industries involves scaling back those industries, and that affects people's livelihoods. How much can those industries adjust to becoming greener, and how much is just greenwash? In a report recorded before COP26 was postponed, BBC Inside Science reporter Jeff Marsh brings us a tale of a proposed plan to build something that, to my ears, sounds like an oxymoron. A carbon-neutral coal mine. Confused? Here's Jeff to explain.
In June last year, then Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Greg Clark, gave a moving speech in Parliament about the government's ambitious plans to reach a net zero emissions target.
So I'm today laying a statutory instrument, in fact it's already before the House, which would amend the 2008 Climate Change Act with a new legally binding net zero emissions target by 2050. Ending our contribution to climate change can be the defining decision of our generation in fulfilling our responsibility to the next.
Hear, hear. And with the UK poised to host COP26 in Glasgow this November, our government have the potential to show the world that we're serious about tackling emissions. But fast forward a few months from Greg Clark's emotive speech in Parliament to a meeting at the Cumbria County Council offices in Kendal in October last year, where a vote is taking place.
Those in favour, please indicate, please.
Pretty well every hand goes up in favour of the first deep coal mine in 30 years.
And those against, please. No against.
Shame on you. Disgusting.
Excuse me.
Emotions are high, presumably because a coal mine would mean vast CO2 emissions well beyond 2050. But can Cumbria County Council be blamed for their decision to reignite this proud industrial town's centuries-old mining heritage? And were the national government right not to intervene? Rebecca Willis and Mike Burness-Lee are professors at Lancaster University's Environment Centre and co-authored a report about the environmental impact of the mine. Here's Rebecca first.
The idea is that coal will be dug out under the Irish Sea, Whitehaven in Cumbria, and that coal is destined for steel production.
And this is being proposed in an area that does desperately need jobs at the moment.
Absolutely, and the main reason that the mine's had local support and support from just about all local politicians is that it's promising 500 jobs. And it's really, really important to have good quality jobs in West Cumbria. I don't deny that for a minute, but I think these are the wrong jobs.
What should Cumbria do in this situation? I can't imagine anyone's expecting them to ignore a tangible opportunity in front of them and just kind of cross their fingers that some green industry is going to move into their town in the next month.
Yeah, so I do have sympathy with Cumbrian politicians and with those local communities. If they're offered 500 jobs, I can see why they will take them. And so I actually think it's incumbent on national government to look at how you can have low carbon industrial strategies for places like the west coast of Cumbria that really need quality jobs and could be at the forefront of a green industrial revolution. And we've seen it work. So over in the Humber, for example, we've seen a wind energy cluster develop where companies have come together and set up a real hub of innovation around wind energy, which is providing local jobs and regenerating the area. I would love to see something like that in West Cumbria.
But in Whitehaven, that currently isn't the case.
Well, if there was green industry jobs, there would be, but there isn't. And that's the problem that we've got around here. You've got one employer, Sellafield, and that's it.
Jobs are needed. What are people going to do? They need a job.
It's a dead spot.
You think it's a dead spot around here?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, they're closing the shops down and everything.
It was a proud mining town.
Yeah.
Do you think that the reopening of a coal mine could bring that back?
Well, it could do, yeah.
Good news for everyone around here.
I was here in the 80s when Kells Colliery was shut, which I think was a crying shame in a way, because it still had a lot of coal left to mine.
There's only Sellafield, and once there's no building down there's nothing. So I think Whitehaven needs that coal mine. They need it, otherwise there's no work.
But with a legally binding commitment to reach net zero by 2050, you might be wondering how West Cumbria Mining got this through the planning permission from Cumbria County Council. Rebecca Willis again.
What the mine have tried to do, and what the County Council have tried to do, is claim that the mine is carbon neutral, and they actually use that phrase, which I find astonishing, by saying that any coal dug out of the ground in West Cumbria will substitute for coal that is not dug out of the ground, that stays in the ground elsewhere in the world. It's absolutely unsubstantiated, and it goes against the most fundamental economic theory. It astounds me that they're allowed to get away with these claims.
There is some truth, is there not, that we import our coking coal at the moment from countries like America and Australia?
The transport emissions from, shipping coal around the world are relevant, but they're insignificant compared to the emissions from burning the coal. So you can't make the claim that transporting coal a shorter distance in any way makes up for the fact that you are digging more of it out the ground. That argument just doesn't add up.
It is hard to argue with that. Carbon-neutral coal mines are fictional, and focusing on transport emissions misses the point. I did reach out to West Cumbria Mining Company and Cumbria County Council for comment, but my requests went unanswered. But another perhaps more reasonable claim made by the mining company is that, the British steel industry isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and currently steel production requires coking coal. But is that true, and for how long? Here's Mike Berners-Lee.
The traditional method for making steel involves getting iron ore, which is iron oxide, and then finding a way of driving the oxygen out of that iron oxide so that you're left with just iron. So you need a reducing agent to do that. And coke has been the traditional reducing agent. But it's also possible to use hydrogen instead as that reducing agent, and you can do that without the use of fossil fuels if all your energy comes from renewables. But even if not, the carbon footprint is still much lower than if you use coke.
Aside from the chemistry, there are other practical considerations too.
If you look at most of Europe's steel industry, it has plans to have totally decarbonised by 2050, which will only be halfway through the lifetime of this mine, leaving the mine totally high and dry. This mine is going to be reliant on the steel industry not having decarbonised until 2070. And there are companies at the moment, I think in Finland and possibly in the Netherlands, but certainly in Europe, that are looking right now to roll out industrial scale use of hydrogen for steelmaking. And it's something like $30 per tonne more expensive at the moment.
So decarbonising the steel industry is possible, but currently the barriers are economic, not technological. But regardless of how quickly the steel industry decarbonises, how can we still be digging up coal as a country while reaching net zero? It is possible under the current system, as I learnt from environmental lawyer Jonathan Church from Client Earth.
Our budgeting system under our UK Climate Change Act concerns just those emissions in the UK. So we can dig up coal, we can extract oil and gas, we can export them, and they might be burnt elsewhere, but that won't show up in our national accounting. I think there are some reasonably good reasons for doing it like that. One is that it's the most simple, measurable, robust way of accounting for what we're doing. It's much harder to count the emissions that we have an impact on in other countries. It's the way that the international legal system works. It's the best way, I think, to avoid issues of double counting or loopholes, things like that. But we need to be really conscious of the risks that as we reduce our emissions, we run the risk of simply offshoring them to other countries. So we need to be conscious of that.
Is this a uniquely UK problem?
I think in the UK, coal is a tiny part of the picture, certainly compared with Asian countries which have, coal as a huge part of their energy mix. And the UK picture in terms of decarbonising our energy mix has been one of great success. That's really where the UK can justifiably say it has led in the last few years. And so I think this particular coal mine is a bit of an anomaly. It's a bit of a curiosity. And it does show, though, that we're not doing everything right if we're digging coal up in 2020.
And as the hosts of COP26 this year, the hypocrisy could be actually very damaging.
Yeah, we need COP26 to be a success, and that means that the UK has to be seen to be a real leader on climate change. And it's got off to a shaky start, politically speaking, and things like this really don't help, because you can't claim to be a climate leader in this day and age if you're still digging coal out of the ground.
Jonathan Church ending that report by Jeff Marsh. We asked the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government whether the coal mine will go ahead and to explain their policy for decarbonising industries like steel and cement, but they haven't responded to our questions. Just after this report was made, new legislative requirements came into force under the SECR, or Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Guidelines. This means that many UK companies will, for the first time, be required to publish a greenhouse gas emissions report together with their annual report. Whilst we had George Monbiot on the line, I asked him what this measure will do.
So this is a move towards what people have been calling the triple bottom line, that rather than companies only being concerned about shareholder value, they've got to be concerned also about their impacts on society and their impacts on the living world. And it's a start. It's a start of the kind we should have made 25 years ago, and some of us have been bellyaching for this start for a very long time, and it's been very frustrating. What it doesn't necessarily lead to is an actual material change in how companies behave. They just have to tell us in slightly more detail how they are behaving. They don't necessarily have to change their behaviour. Of course, it then gives campaigners some leverage to say, well, you're performing very badly. You are still producing loads of climate changing gases, and that is driving us towards disaster. So we're going to lobby the government to regulate you and to stop you from behaving so irresponsibly. So it's useful, but it's not in itself a solution, because what we need are structural solutions to what is a structural problem. Governments have to be able to stand up and say, sorry, folks, we are leaving fossil fuels in the ground. It doesn't matter how much reporting you do. It doesn't matter how green you say you are. If you're still digging out that coal and oil and gas and burning it, then those are activities which we are going to regulate out of existence, and we're going to do that in very short order. And it's only action on that kind of scale which is commensurate with the emergency that we have to grapple with, which is climate breakdown.
Thanks to George Monbiot. That's it for this week. Gareth Mitchell is presenting next week, where he'll be untangling the confusion surrounding coronavirus death rates. This has been Inside Science. I'm Marnie Chesterton, and the programme is produced by the lovely Fiona Roberts of the BBC Radio Science Unit. Bye for now.